Good day. Before I proceed with this program, I should say that I'm making it very early in the morning of Friday, the 3rd of February, the day upon which this video will appear. So early in the morning that, of course, it's likely that there will be many developments over the course of the day, which I will not be able to cover in this video. I would say that as of now, which is to say early in the morning on Saturday the 3rd of February, there has been no information so far of General Zaluzhny having been dismissed by President Zelensky. To all appearances, Zaluzhny remains in post. What we are getting, however, is confirmation of American airstrikes taking place not across the Middle East, but in two specific countries, Syria and Iraq. And allegedly around 85 strikes have happened, and something like 125 precision-guided weapons have been used, which, for the record, would make it about average as a strike for the kind of strikes that the Russians now regularly undertaken in the fighting in Ukraine. But anyway, more about that later. But anyway, the Americans have conducted their strikes and they've confined their attacks on positions of various Syrian and Iraqi militias in Syria and Iraq. Now, there have been no attacks on Iran so far, and the word for the moment is that there won't be, that the United States, after what has clearly been a significant internal battle, has decided that the dangers of an attack on Iran are simply too great, and for the moment the wiser, calmer heads have prevailed. So instead we have these missile attacks on all of these militias, people who are already long accustomed to fighting, who face no pressure from in the form of a ground offensive, who are able to melt into the population, and who probably have had long experience by now of hardening their facilities where they really matter. I cannot imagine that these strikes, conducted on the scale that they have been, are going to change anything significant in the overall balance of forces or political geometry of the Middle East. So far as I can see, these strikes are more likely to provoke than to deter. On the contrary, any actors, militias, fighters, forces aligned with Iran that have been attacked, and of course Iran itself, will have concluded that the United States is going to pull its punches, that it's afraid of a war, and that in light of this, they can, given the ongoing crisis in Gaza, continue their attacks on the United States, on the forces of the United States in the Middle East, because any American reaction is likely to be limited. Well, I'm not going to criticize this too much. I have consistently taken the view that a strike on Iran, something which the usual pack of neocons have been agitating for ever since the events of on 7th October, the Hamas attack on Israel took place. Anyway, they've been agitating for this strike on Iran, and no doubt will continue to do so. I have consistently said that a strike on Iran would be a disaster, that it would certainly plunge the United States into a regional war in the Middle East, that it would only end up making the situation for the United States far, far worse than it is already. So given that, as I said, wiser heads in the United States, in Washington, have decided to come to the same view, and have decided that an attack on Iran would be an extremely bad idea, I'm not going to criticize them for not doing it. On the contrary, I am, in that respect, breathing a sigh of relief. But given all we've heard, given all we've seen about the situation in the Middle East, I come back to this question, which I've asked many times. What, in the end, are these bomb strikes and missile strikes that the United States is undertaking now realistically going to achieve? They're not going to deter, they're not going to destroy or dismantle the entire apparatus of all of these militias. They're not going to weaken the Iranian influence in the Middle East. The attacks on the Houthis in Yemen have not resulted in a reduction in Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. In fact, there's even a report circulating, almost certainly a true report, that one Houthi missile that was launched at an American warship came within a mile of hitting it. Not perhaps a strike, but dangerously close to one, perhaps unnerving for the US, and perhaps even more so for some of the other navies, the Royal Navy, for example, whose warships are also in the area, operating alongside the United States Navy, and whose ships are less well protected than those of the United States. So the attacks on the Houthis have achieved nothing. What is the probability that these attacks on people in Iraq and Syria are going to achieve anything either? They're likely to enrage the Iraqi government and the Iraqi parliament especially. The Iraqi government has made it very clear over the last couple of days that it wants US forces to leave Iraq. And they've been trying to get an agreement with the United States for US forces to leave Iraq. For the moment, at least, these negotiations have taken place at a low key, and we are, for the moment at least, engaged in some kind of a negotiation process. There have been political forces in Iraq that have been agitating to get US forces out of Iraq for a long time, and the Iraqi parliament and various iterations of that parliament have on several occasions voted for US forces to leave Iraq. Nonetheless, the United States apparently did not consult the Iraqi government about these strikes, some of which are taking place in Iraq. Is it not likely, or at least possible, that these attacks on Iraqi militias, some of which have political influence in Baghdad, is going to crystallize opposition in Iraq to the continued presence of the Americans in that country? After all, what exactly are these US troops doing in Iraq now? Always one hears that they're fighting ISIS, but my sense is that ISIS is a spent force in Iraq exactly as it is in Syria. The Iraqis, especially after these attacks, will surely be worrying that their country is about to become a battlefield in a proxy war between the United States and Iran. And it will be completely unsurprising if most Iraqis, Shia and Sunni, decide that they do not want to be involved in that sort of a proxy war, and therefore insist that the American troops leave. Well, I think the American troops should leave Iraq. I don't think they're doing anything valuable there at all. But of course, if they leave because they are told to go by the Iraqi government, it will be another blow to American prestige in the Middle East. And what about the situation in Syria? Well, all of this whole latest iteration in the crisis began because of a drone attack, nature and circumstances of which, as I pointed out, based on observations that the former CIA analyst Larry Johnson had made, a drone attack on Tower 22 of the sprawling Al-Tanf complex, a drone attack that still leaves open many questions. Yet, the fact is that the United States has decided to retaliate and launched these attacks. And of course, we come back to Al-Tanf, the particular facility within the giant Al-Tanf complex that was attacked is located in Jordan. But the base itself, most of it, is located on Syrian territory. This is despite the fact that the UN Security Council has never authorized the establishment of American bases on Syrian territory, and despite the fact that the Syrian government, the internationally recognized and legitimate Syrian government, which represents the country in the United Nations, and with which some Western countries continue to have diplomatic relations, well, the Syrian government vehemently opposes their presence. Nonetheless, we not only have a base in Syria, which has been attacked, but now we have American airstrikes carried out in eastern Syria against the opposition of the legal, legitimate Syrian government. And it isn't just the Syrian government, probably large numbers of Syrians as well. They're probably not going to be happy. They're going to be very angry, in fact, about the further violation of the sovereignty of their country. And they must be thinking again, what happens if the Americans decide to wage a proxy war against Iran, or maybe not even a proxy war, an actual war between the United States itself and Iranian-backed Syrian militias on Syrian territory. Very easy to see how this situation could spiral out of control. Whilst I hope that this doesn't happen, the possibility of further American casualties must be very real, and the longer this goes on for, the greater the risk that even despite the obvious reluctance to get drawn into an out-and-out confrontation with Iran, the United States will find itself inexorably drawn towards that point by the logic of the conflict in the Middle East and through the vociferous demands of all the usual people in Washington. Let me say again what I have said so many times. This refusal to undertake sensible diplomacy in the Middle East, to try to get a grip on the crisis, which means, first and foremost, getting a grip on the crisis in Gaza, the failure to work out a plan about how to deal with this larger problem of the Middle East, the sense that there is an overall drift in American policy, and the growing exasperation across the region as the United States turns into a spoiler, simply obstructing all diplomatic moves made in the United Nations by all of the other players. All of that is now increasingly setting us up for a further clash. These missile strikes, thankfully, have not gone the whole way. They have not yet resulted, probably, in an overall regional war. They have not resulted in a direct conflict so far with Iran. But nobody should feel happy with the situation that we see today, because the reality is, through the very act of launching these strikes, the United States, the Biden administration, has taken a further step towards that point, which it says it doesn't want to reach: a strike on Iran and the wider war that is bound to follow. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about all of this today. That we will no doubt be getting a lot more news tomorrow, and when I do my next video, which, over the course of today, I should say, when I do my next video tomorrow, I will be in a position to provide an update on exactly what is happening. Anyway, let's move on to that other crisis, the one in Ukraine. And as I said at the start of the program, General Zaluzhny, to all appearances, remains in post. There's a rather interesting piece, which I touched on in a recent video, about Zaluzhny, again by Seymour Hersh. And Hersh again repeats the claim that Zaluzhny and Gerasimov, the Russian commander-in-chief, are engaged in some kind of secret negotiation with each other. Well, I've already made it quite clear that I don't believe that any such secret negotiation between Gerasimov and Zaluzhny is taking place. It does seem that there are contacts between the Ukrainian and Russian militaries to exchange prisoners. The United Arab Emirates is playing, as we know, a mediating role in that, but that in no way resembles the sort of political negotiations between Zaluzhny and Gerasimov to resolve, to end the war, that Hersh was talking about in an earlier article. However, if you read Seymour Hersh's latest piece a little more carefully, I think another picture emerges, which is that Zaluzhny may not be talking to Gerasimov. At least he may not be having direct negotiations about a settlement of the conflict. There might be contacts about exchanges of prisoners and that kind of thing. But Zaluzhny might not be talking to the Russians. But it does rather look from Seymour Hersh's piece that he is in fact talking to the Americans. And in fact, there have been several reports, in fact, the reports have been circulating for some time, that Zaluzhny has developed some kind of a relationship with some of the senior military people in the Pentagon, whereas his erstwhile rival, Kirill Budanov, the intelligence chief, who might eventually take over from Zaluzhny if Zelensky is successful in dismissing Zaluzhny. Anyway, supposedly, Budanov's major dealings are with the British, and in a sense, Budanov is backed by the British, whereas Zaluzhny is supposedly being backed by the Americans. Anyway, that's one view. I'm not going to pretend that I have any knowledge or understanding of all of this. But if you read the article carefully, it appears to say that some people in the United States, one of the reasons why they want Zaluzhny to remain in place, these are military people, I think, is because they are looking to Zaluzhny eventually to help the United States out of this hole by trying to come at least to some kind of understanding with the Russians, presumably another variant of the freeze idea. And this does actually chime a little with an article by Mark Galeotti in the London Times. Mark Galeotti spoke again about the dismay of many European officials. He had mentioned that one European diplomat at one of the embassies in Kiev, in particular, phoned him to talk about it, that there are some people who are utterly dismayed, who are shocked by news that Zaluzhny was being sacked, and they were very relieved when the news began to circulate that he had not been sacked, and this diplomat is supposed to have told Galeotti that perhaps, just possibly, the Ukrainian government, that's to say Zelensky and his people, are coming to their senses. And this does make me wonder whether Zaluzhny continues to have some backing from people in the United States and in Europe who are still hoping or gambling that eventually he will be able to come to some kind of deal with the Russians or understanding with the Russians, which will end the war, something which they understand now Zelensky will never do. I'm going to say simply this about that. If this is indeed the case, and if it is indeed the case that some Western officials, even whilst Victoria Nuland comes to Kiev and appears to be backing Zelensky against Zaluzhny. Anyway, even if some Western officials think that Zaluzhny might one day come to their rescue and do some kind of deal with the Russians, I think they are deluding themselves. I think they have wildly misjudged the man. I don't think Zaluzhny is remotely capable of conducting a negotiation with the Russians. My own understanding of him is that he is very much someone whose political beliefs align with the most hardline elements of the Ukrainian national movement. I understand that he has been packing the most radicalized units of the Ukrainian army with the best equipment and personnel, strengthening them at the expense of the regular army. And frankly, I've seen no sign at any time that he's seriously going to try to negotiate with the Russians. But anyway, there we go. It, to some extent, doesn't really matter, because the key point for the moment is that both Zelensky and Zaluzhny are in post. Zelensky hasn't so far managed to sack Zaluzhny. Apparently he can't find a general willing to take Zaluzhny's place, which is astonishing. It shows a complete repudiation by the military of Zelensky's leadership. It speaks of a fundamental division between the military and the politicians in Ukraine. It suggests that different factions in the West are backing different players in Kiev. And to reiterate again, whatever Victoria Nuland did or tried to do, if Zelensky cannot sack Zaluzhny in this desperately unsustainable situation, his days as president of Ukraine must be surely numbered. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this, because of course this situation could change. It might be that by the time you're watching this program, Zaluzhny is gone and someone else, perhaps Budanov, is indeed finally taking his place. And, well, we could also be looking at even more dramatic developments depending on how the military and civilian society in Ukraine respond to those kind of changes. But anyway, none of that's happened yet. So having made that point, that's where I'm going to stop in my discussion of the political situation in Ukraine today. Now, yesterday, I gave an account of an address that the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, had given to the leadership of the Russian armed forces. I mentioned that he was no longer talking about active defense. He was talking about the Russians having the strategic initiative right across the battle lines. And I said that he was speaking about the Ukrainians being forced to commit their last reserves to the battle. And just before Shoigu made those comments, which, as I pointed out, provide a vivid illustration of the workings of aggressive attrition. The Russians pressing the Ukrainians right across the battlefronts, applying constant pressure on them, preventing the Ukrainians from resting and organizing and rebuilding, and continuing to burn up Ukrainian reserves and personnel and equipment at terrifying rates. 23,000 men killed or wounded, according to Zaluzhny, in January alone. According to Shoigu, in January alone. Perhaps it was more than that. Anyway, Shoigu gave, in some ways, a very interesting sense of how attrition, strategic attrition, works. Well, as it happens, on 29th January, an article appeared in a Russian newspaper called Vzglyad, written by a person called Yevgeny Krutikov. Now, I only know about this article because it's been discussed at great and very erudite length by John Helmer at Dances with Bears. Let me repeat again, Helmer, more than any other non-Russian journalist today, has an understanding, a feel for the Russian military, and tracks closely their opinions, their views, and is able to convey effectively their thinking. And of course, Helmer has pointed out many times that in Dances with Bears, that Vzglyad, this newspaper, is well known in Russia to be very closely aligned with Russia's military leadership. The entity which Helmer and a few Russians also continues to refer to as the Stavka. And Krutikov's piece in Vzglyad provides a further illustration of aggressive attrition as it is being conducted on the battlefronts today. Now, Krutikov wrote this piece in response to the news that Avdeyevka had been captured, this tiny village in Kharkiv region. But he says this, and this he says in Vzglyad, we're not just facing the capture of a village. Russian troops are now hacking into the contact lines which have not budged for a year. Russia is creating a new strategic situation in the Kharkiv region, threatening to dismember the Ukrainian defense up to the Donetsk agglomeration. First, Crumble, then Avdeyevka, Russian troops have advanced in the Svatovo direction, pushing the enemy to a new line of defense to the village of Peshanoye. Slightly to the north, already close to Kupiansk, the enemy's positions are gradually moving to the west and southwest. And then he talks about how the Russians are gradually pushing the Ukrainians back in the area in Kupiansk. And then he says, at first glance, we're looking at isolated episodes of positional warfare, but this is not quite true. Even in this scenario, as published so far, strategic threats arise for the Ukrainian military. For example, in the possible drive of the Russian army to the Oskol River, which would have far-reaching prospects. However, the key point is that in the Kupiansk area, there is a major defense crisis. It seems that the defense in Kupiansk has been poorly organized. And then he goes on to say that because the situation in Kupiansk is beginning to become unbearable for Ukraine, the Ukrainians are having to commit forces to try to hold the positions in Kupiansk itself, and that they're obliged to transfer forces from the southern front lines, the areas where Ukraine launched its summer offensive, and to try to plug the holes in Kupiansk. But he says that there are problems in doing that too, because the Russian army has gradually regained some of the positions which it left during the counteroffensive, and its forces continue to move forward. We're even talking about possible threats to Orekhov, a rearguard city for the Ukrainian military, from which all communications and command of the counteroffensive were carried out. And then he goes on to say, behind the defensive fortifications of the Ukrainian military, an open field of tens of kilometers opens up on a whole group of sites. Kiev's military reserves are gradually being squandered, and there is practically no human material left to plug the holes. Related to the problems, there are the panic campaigns in Kiev about mobilization. And then Krutikov goes on to say that the Ukraine is also now suffering from a crisis in terms of its numbers of officers. The attrition of, there is another problem, the attrition of officers. Western military personnel cannot replace this crucial resource. They can only be used to service technically complicated weapons systems such as air defense or long-range artillery. Along the line of contact, foreign officers are more likely to interfere due to their ignorance of the language and misunderstanding of the mentality of their Ukrainian subordinates. And then he says that all this in general creates a strategic opportunity to seriously change the situation on the line of contact. Partial tactical success must at some point turn into a major breakthrough in the enemy's defense. We're talking about such a breakthrough that will not stop in just 2 or 3 days at the next defensive line, but will lead inevitably, precisely, to the collapse of the front. This is exactly what the effort of the Russian military is now aimed at. probing for weaknesses in Ukrainian defense positions. Sooner or later, the Ukrainian military will not have time to create a new defensive line behind a particular settlement, and then we will see how the special military operation will break the current positional deadlock. So, or rather sophisticated explanation, but in essence, what he's saying, what Krutikov is saying, is that the Russians are piling on the pressure right along the line of contact. We can already see signs that the Ukrainian defense is thinning, is becoming more disorganized, that there's problems with the number and quality of officers, that the reserves are being burnt up, and sooner or later that crack will come through which the Russian army can then pile in and flood through. And if you think about it, that again describes aggressive attrition, grinding down the Ukrainian military in advance of the big offensive which is to come. And importantly, it exactly corresponds with what Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, was saying yesterday, that the Russians are holding the initiative right along the line of contact, that they're improving their positions, and that the Ukrainians are being forced to commit their last reserves. Now, Helmer himself has quite a lot to say about all of this, and he says that the Russian military leadership are starting to sense that the breaking point for Ukraine is not far away. And he says, he starts his article, and it's titled, by the way, is Breakthrough on All Fronts Ahead of Schedule. But he says, when the General Staff have been discussing with President Putin the timing of the Russian offensive to force the Kiev regime into capitulation, it has been agreed, understood, and repeated that the strategic reserves of the Ukrainian forces should be destroyed first, together with the supply lines for the weapons and ammunition crossing the border from the United States and NATO. And there's been reinforcing these preconditions for the timing of the Russian offensive. General Winter and General Patience have joined the Stavka meetings. This week, military sources believe there's been a turning point on the Ukrainian battlefield and on the Russian clock. The Daily Defense Ministry briefing reported last Thursday before the Friday weekly summary that Ukrainian losses had increased. The casualty rate is unusually high. The shift to offense is recognizably new, if not announced. And he then goes on to say, according to a military source outside Russia, the Russian breakthrough is beginning to happen now. It's being coordinated with strikes and raids along the northern border. The commitment of the crack Ukrainian brigades at the expense of other sectors shows how desperate Zaluzhny is to plug the holes. He knows that the target is the isolation of Kharkiv, the establishment of a demilitarized buffer zone, as well as the development of a situation whereby all Ukrainian forces east of the Dnieper are threatened with being cut off, and he's quickly running out of ammunition, not to mention men. By the end of this winter, the source added, The Ukrainians will barely be able to move along the roads they used to feed the front due to the Russian drone, missile, conventional air and artillery strikes. Once they can no longer plug the gaps with mechanized units acting as fighting brigades, is just a matter of time before the big breakthroughs and encirclements begin. At the current burn rate, I imagine we'll start seeing Russian tanks with fuel tanks fitted for extended range appearing and Russian airborne troops making air assaults in the Ukrainian rear within weeks. Now, I have discussed all of this, this article by Helmer, the article by Krutikov, because it seems to me to correspond so well with what Shoigu has said. And notice that this article by Helmer came out, as I understand it, before Shoigu's address to the military. And clearly, something is going on in Moscow. And maybe it's not unrelated to the fact that President Putin has himself now spoken about the establishment of a buffer zone, a large buffer zone to protect Russian cities. These are so far just articles. As I've said many times, the Russian military, like the Ukrainian military and the West, is very skilled at keeping its secrets. But for the record, I think that the Russians are starting to sense that aggressive attrition, which of course built on the achievement of passive attrition during the Ukrainian offensive and an earlier period of aggressive attrition in the Battle of Bakhmut. But I think that the Russians are starting to sense that this period of attrition is coming towards its close, and that the days of more prolonged advances, of breakthroughs and offensives, real sustained offensives, might not be that far away. Anyway, all very interesting. Now, what is actually happening on the battlefronts? Well, as it happens, the last 24 hours, there's been a certain amount of news from some of the battlefronts, but as tends to happen when things become really important in one place, events in Avdeyevka are now dominating the information that's coming out, and it is to Avdeyevka that I will first turn. Now, over the last 2 weeks, we've seen a big Russian advance in southern Avdeyevka. The Russians have captured the Tsar's hunting lodge, and it's universally believed that they've also, well, it's widely believed that they've also captured the air defense base to the southwest of Avdeyevka, though I understand that Ukrainian commentators dispute this. But anyway, they are well established in the southern outskirts of Avdeyevka, and they've taken positions in southern Avdeyevka itself. And of course, we've had many stories about how they used an advance along a drain pipe to outflank the Ukrainian defenses in the Tsar's hunting lodge area, which, as I said, I'm not saying that isn't true. But as I discussed in my previous video, it seems that the Russians have now also managed a major advance from the northwest deep into Avdeyevka itself, and that they're in a position to threaten the Ukrainian forces in the center of Avdeyevka, potentially splitting the town in two. Now, over the course of the day, we've had a cascade of reports coming from Avdiivka, and all of them point to a growing military crisis for the Ukrainian defenders. It seems that the Russians have been steadily expanding their areas of control in southern Avdiivka. I'm going to make a guess that with the advance towards central Avdiivka from the northwest, Ukrainian counterattacks on Russian positions in the south of Avdiivka have come to a complete stop, and that it is no longer possible to sustain those kind of counterattacks. In fact, I would not be surprised if the redeployment of troops to try to throw back the Russians from southern Avdiivka left the Ukrainians short of troops alongst other parts of the Avdiivka perimeter, which made it easier for the Russians to advance into Avdiivka from the northwest. So the Russians are gradually tightening control in that area of Avdiivka, the south of Avdiivka. But there are apparently also reports that the Russian forces that have advanced into Avdiivka from the northwest are also now starting to expand their area of control towards the west. And various reporters, Valterson, the military summary channel, are now starting to discuss the situation as if Ukrainian supply lines into Avdiivka might eventually become threatened. And I should say that there seems to be a slight difference in perspective between Valterson and the military summary channel about what the Russians might do. Valterson seems to think that the Russians will firstly clear up all remaining Ukrainian positions around Avdiivka before trying to storm the town. The military summary channel appears to think that if the Russians are able to capture certain positions, that the defense in Avdiivka might collapse more suddenly than Valterson appears to think. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the detail of this. I'm hardly an expert enough to be able to say. But anyway, whatever. The fact is that the Ukrainian position in Avdiivka has deteriorated dramatically. And following the sharp deterioration we saw last week with the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in southern Avdiivka, the Ukrainians are now faced with a major crisis in the central and northern part of Avdiivka, with a potential threat to their supply lines as well. And as a number of people have pointed out, this advance from the north and this advance from the south are starting to have something of the look of pincers about them. The distance between the troops, the forward positions of each pincer, at the moment is around 5 kilometers, which is a long distance, I would have thought, in a built-up area such as Avdiivka. But anyway, it does look as if Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka itself are becoming increasingly unstable. And this is also affecting other Ukrainian positions, especially to the northeast of Avdiivka, in a filtration plant and other such places. It seems to me that these Russian advances are threatening to leave these Ukrainian troops cut off from reinforcement and resupply, and in a situation where they will be trapped and before long will have no real option other than to fight to the last, or perhaps more sensibly to surrender. Now, to some extent, I should say that these developments remind me a little of what happened in the fighting in Bakhmut. There was a lot of talk in the Battle of Bakhmut that the Russians would try to encircle the whole of Bakhmut by storming the villages of Crumble, Bogdanovka, and Ivaniivka, and that they would create a cauldron trapping the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. This didn't ever happen. Instead, what happened was that the Wagner forces, through advances within Bakhmut itself, managed in the end to cut the main supply roads into Bakhmut, literally at the outskirts of the town itself. And this did put the Ukrainian defenders in Bakhmut in a terrible position. And it looks to me as if what the Russians are doing in Avdeyevka parallels that. In fact, I suspect that the Russians have learnt a great deal from the way in which the Wagner organization conducted the Battle of Bakhmut in the spring of last year. So, anyway, we will see how things turn out. Interestingly, no one any longer is talking about fighting in Stepovoye and Berdichi and those places to the northwest of Avdeyevka. I am sure that intense fighting is continuing there. All of the events within Avdeyevka itself confirm what I have started to suspect for some time, that the fighting in Stepovoye and Berdichi and along the railway was first and foremost a pinning operation, preventing the Ukrainians from reinforcing Avdeyevka, the garrison in Avdeyevka, to the extent that it needed to be reinforced if it was going to repel successfully these Russian attacks upon it. Anyway, that's Avdeyevka. It does seem to me as if we have certainly seen a turning point in the battle for Avdeyevka, and it is quite likely, I would have thought, that at some point in the next few weeks, Avdeyevka will finally fall. It's clear to me now that it is falling, and with Ukrainian troops short of ammunition and short of men, and with the Russians controlling the sky, how is Ukraine going to reverse this deteriorating situation? Anyway, these are not the only areas where things are going badly for Ukraine. There have been some reports of Ukrainian counterattacks in the Bakhmut area, that the Ukrainians have launched some kind of a counterattack in Bogdanovka to the northwest of Bakhmut and pushed the Russians back some hundreds of meters. Possibly true. But, as I said already, aggressive attrition almost invites attacks like this if they increase the scale of Ukrainian losses, which is what I suspect has happened. In other places on the battlefront, things continue to go badly for Ukraine. There's reports that the Russians have made further advances in the Liman area. Ukrainian losses in the Liman area appear to be especially heavy at the moment, and the Russians seem to be continuing their work, gradually engulfing the villages of Kislelovka and, well, certain villages anyway, in the Kupiansk area, villages which I still haven't fully learned how to pronounce. The Russians are gradually in the process of gaining control of those. And as Krutikov was saying in that article in Vzglyad, it seems that the Russians are encountering an increasingly disorganized defense in the Kupiansk area, with Ukrainian defenses becoming increasingly improvised as the Ukrainian forces right across the battle lines become overstretched. So, there we are. Now, a further thing to say about the fighting on the battlefields. We're now in February. At some point this month, I suspect we're going to start to get more Russian missile attacks across Ukraine. A big drone attack took place over the last couple of hours. I'm still not fully clear as to exactly what took place over the course of it. Now, Putin himself has been very active. He has been to the city of Tula, one of the main industrial and manufacturing regions near Moscow in Russia. It's a famous city in terms of its armaments industries. It's also, for the record, the major city closest to Yasnaya Polyana, Lev Tolstoy, the writer Lev Tolstoy's famous estate, and it's also the city where the samovar, a famous Russian teapot, was invented in the 18th century, apparently in order to provide hot water and tea for the soldiers when they were on campaign. I'm just saying. But anyway, Putin was there. He has had meetings with people in the military industries in Tula. He's spoken about huge increases in production, military production, which are taking place. He seemed extremely glowing, is almost the expression, over the achievements of the Russian military industrial complex. He was talking about how in some categories of weapons, production has increased by orders of magnitude above the levels that it had reached before the special military operation. And he also said that he said words to the effect that the myth of the superiority of Western weapons has been debunked. Modern Western weapons, he said, are mostly, but not always, better than Soviet weapons of the late Soviet period. And after all, the Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago, so that would be unsurprising. But he said that in terms of modern Russian weapons, the weapons that the Russians produce now, Russian weapons are often significantly better than analogous Western weapons. I think people who have been following the war would agree with him. Anyway, Putin spoke up and said all sorts of favorable things, therefore, about the Russian military-industrial complex. Remember that he is facing an election next month, so you could see this again as a part, this visit as a part of his election campaign. Not that anybody seriously doubts that he's going to win the election. But Putin's visit to Tula and his address to the workers in the military industries inevitably brings me to an article that has, by I'm sure pure coincidence, appeared in the Financial Times. And it speaks about the surprising resilience of the Russian economy. And heavy public spending on defense has led to a rebound in growth, but, this is always the Financial Times, so there has to be a but, could also be storing up problems for the near future. And the article then grudgingly concedes that the IMF is upgrading Russia's growth rate. It now predicts that Russia will achieve growth of 2.6% this year. It also grudgingly concedes that Russia has surpassed Germany in terms of the size of its GDP calculated on purchasing power parity. It says the Russian economy's resilience had stunned many economists who had believed the initial round of sanctions over the invasion nearly 2 years ago would cause a catastrophic contraction. And then the Financial Times comes up with comments like this. Instead, they say, presumably the same economists who'd anticipated the catastrophic contraction, the Kremlin has spent its way out of a recession by evading Western attempts to limit its revenues on energy sales and by ramping up defense spending. And we are then told that defense spending, it's been possible to sustain this defense spending because Russia continues to receive high receipts from its energy sales. All of this would have been impossible if Russia had not continued to generate colossal revenues from its energy resources despite sanctions. In 2023, Russia's energy revenues reached 8.8 trillion rubles, a decline of about a quarter from the record-breaking result in 2022, but above the average for the past 10 years. The last, by the way, I think that is the first admission in the Financial Times that what happened in 2023 was that Russian revenues from oil and gas simply reverted to their average level after the enormous surge in 2022. So the Europeans cutting themselves off from Russian oil and gas has left them with higher prices for energy, which has in turn led to a contraction of the European economy. But the Russians, for their part, have been able to continue to sell oil and gas, and their receipts, their energy receipts last year were at the average level that they've been achieving over the previous 10 years. And then we have this utterly bizarre comment from somebody called Elena Rybakova, a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. The regime is resilient because it sits on an oil rig. The Russian economy now is like a gas station that has started producing tanks. Now, how can a gas station produce tanks? I mean, it's an absurd claim. The reason military production is increasing in Russia is because Russia has a very large industrial base, technological and scientific and industrial base. It would not have been able to increase military production were it otherwise. And yes, energy revenues are certainly important in the overall funding of the budget. Nobody disputes that. But it's not just energy revenues that are keeping the budget in rough balance. The reason it is happening is because the economy overall is growing, as we saw last year, and that is why the budget deficit last year was just over 1.5%, which is around 1.5%, despite the fact that spending has increased and energy revenues fell by comparison with their levels in 2022. And until this point is understood, I think that people in the West will continue to get this wrong. They will assume that Russia can somehow be exhausted into submission, that this economic surge will eventually burn itself out, and that Russia will face an economic implosion in the way that the Soviet Union supposedly did. The reality is that the problems of the Soviet Union were far more complex and had far more causes than Western commentators seem to understand. That is a complex subject, which I will one day return to, probably in a dedicated program, not for this program today. But the Soviet experience, in my opinion, has limited relevance to the situation in Russia today, when the economy, unlike the economy of the Soviet Union, operates with flexible prices determined by demand and supply, rather than within the rigid price structure, state-controlled price structure, which distorted and ultimately unbalanced the Soviet Union. Anyway, I just wanted to also observe the deep anger that there is in the West towards the economic technocrats who run Russia. One of the major assumptions that many people in Western governments made was that the technocrats, the very, very capable technocrats that run Russia, the people in the finance ministry, the central bank, people like the central bank chair, Elvira Nabiullina, and the finance minister, Anton Siluanov, that they would turn on Putin, walk out of the government, and that the whole structure would collapse behind them. They did not expect that Siluanov and Nabiullina might see themselves as part of a team committed to supporting the Russian economy and navigating it through the problems, whatever problems the West is causing for it. And the result is that there is real anger towards them in the West, towards these people, who are somehow felt to have betrayed the expectations that the West had in them. Consider, for example, this comment, which appears in this article, from Alexander Prokopenko, who we're told is a former Russian central bank official, but is obviously very Western aligned, since she's made this comment in an interview to the Financial Times. She says the economic bloc, the finance ministry and central bank, keeps saving the regime. They have been proven to be much more useful for Putin than the generals. Which is, of course, simply a way of admitting that the Russian economy is very well run. A point I and a few others have been making for many years, but which people in the West simply don't want to acknowledge, and that Putin leads a united team, which, by the way, even some people within Russia weren't prepared to acknowledge. Anyway, there we go. There's been further admissions, by the way, in the Financial Times that weapons production in Russia is now rising at such a fast level that Ukraine is finding it all but impossible to balance out, to contain the Russian offensive. And the article does talk about problems within the Russian economy, labor shortages. I've discussed that in various programs. The fact that there's also been problems with inflation, though I suspect that's going to start coming down fairly soon, and things like that. But anyway, the point is that the Russian economy is able to continue growth. It is able to maintain production, and it is able to maintain production of weapons. As we have seen over the last few weeks, the West has struggled to do the same. The gap will continue to grow, and that sooner or later is going to lead to a situation where we are going to see that breakthrough that more and more people in Russia are predicting. A breakthrough on the battle lines, which I suspect will result in the final end, or at least the beginning of the end of this war. Well, this is where I end my program today. I'm sure, as I said, that there'll be more developments over the next few hours. I'll be coming back to them in my program tomorrow. Just to remind you once more, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget to you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can check out our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.